Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Johnny's Ambassadors Expert Webinar Series for Parents. I'm your host, Laura Stack. I'm the founder and CEO of Johnny's Ambassadors, where we educate parents and teens about the dangers of today's potent marijuana products, especially for adolescent brain development, mental illness, and suicide. Johnny's Ambassadors was formed in 2020 after our son Johnny died by suicide after becoming psychotic from using potent marijuana concentrates. So we have another guest with us today who is incredible, whom I will introduce in just a moment after we go over a couple quick logistics. This session is being recorded. Please share it with your friends and family. Susan has provided a handout, which is a PDF with room for notes with her slides. That is in your control panel under the handouts section or on this page if you are watching the recording. Dr. Weiss will present for about 45 minutes, and then she will take your questions for 15 minutes afterward. So as you think of them, please type them into the question box, and at the end, I will read them off to her in the order we received them. So without any further ado, I will introduce Dr. Susan Weiss, who is the Director, Division of Extramural Research at the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIDA, which oversees NIDA's extramural programs, research training, operation planning, and trans NIH initiatives, such as the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development, or ABCD study. Dr. Weiss is also a senior science advisor to the NIDA director. Previously, she served as the chief of the science policy branch and acting director of NIDA's Office of Science Policy and Communications, where she provided leadership and oversight for all of NIDA's interactions with its diverse stakeholders. Susan, thank you so much for being here and for being one of Johnny's ambassadors.
Thanks very much, Laura. I really appreciate the invitation. I think this is an incredibly important endeavor that you are on, and I'm truly sorry for the reasons that you had to develop this program. But I hope that it will be helpful for other parents and prevent.
Exactly. Thank you.
So it's nice to be here, and I'm gonna be going through quite a variety of different areas. So it's going to be a bit of a whirlwind, I think. We'll try to go slowly, but I also look forward to hearing your questions afterwards. My conflicts of interest are that I hold a very small amount of stock in Merck and GE. So just to give you an idea of what I'm going to be discussing today, I'm going to start out by talking about how cannabis works in the brain, the endocannabinoid system, which is the system through which it acts. A little bit about the evolving landscape of products, which you've already heard a little bit about from Laura. Some of the long-term health effects that we are most concerned about, a bit on cannabidiol, and then I will end talking about the changing cannabis policies and their impact on public health. So I start with this slide, even though it's a fairly complicated slide, but there's a few points that I think are really important to think about as we start talking about it. First of all, as we all know, cannabis is a plant. It contains more than 120 different cannabinoids plus other types of chemicals. The two that we talk about most are THC, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the component of the plant that's responsible for most of the effects that we associate with it. It's the component that makes people high, that affects their thinking, their memory, their coordination. And then cannabidiol, which is I will come back to later, which is actually a very different type of cannabinoid. It has very different actions, and it's gained tremendously in popularity in recent years. So this plant is illegal under US federal law. However, 36 states plus DC have legalized it for medical use, and 18 states plus DC have legalized it for adult use. And this is changing rapidly. Almost every time I do this presentation, I have to change my map. There are also some states that have legalized low THC products. So these are mostly CBD products for medical use, usually very limited medical use. And in 2018, the cannabis plant was sort of broken up into two categories, one being hemp, which is the cannabis plant containing less than 0.3% THC, and that was actually taken out of the Controlled Substances Act, and it is often used to extract CBD. But the rest of the plant, and which I'll be talking about either as cannabis or as marijuana, is really defined as marijuana because it contains greater amounts of THC, and depending upon what the concentrations are, you get different types of effects. There are also versions of the active ingredients that have been FDA approved. The most recent one is the plant-derived version of cannabidiol, which is called Epidiolex, and it's used to treat severe seizure disorders in children. So when we talk about it, it's just important that we use the correct language, whether we're talking about the plant, whether we're talking about cannabinoids, whether we're talking about THC products, or are we talking about CBD? And these often kind of get used in differing ways, and I think it's important that we stay clear on that. So I think we all have a pretty good idea of what marijuana's acute effects are during the intoxication phase. People can feel relaxed, they can have increased sensation, their perception of time differs. It affects coordination and balance. It can increase heart rate, and there's some evidence that there are instances of heart attacks, especially in younger people, or strokes that may be related to marijuana's acute effects. It increases the risks of car accidents about twofold, which is not as high as alcohol, which is about eightfold at the legal limit. But together they are even small amounts of both can make the situation worse. It affects cognition. It makes it difficult for people to learn new things, difficult to do complex types of tasks. It affects executive function, which has to do with decision making and risky behavior. And it can also have very negative effects on mood, especially after high doses or edibles, which are much more difficult to control the dosing on. It can cause very severe anxiety and panic attacks, psychosis, and paranoia. So the reason it has such a variety of effects has to do with how THC works in the brain. And this is a slide just to give you a sense that there are many different areas of the brain that contain a large amount of these cannabinoid receptors where THC acts. And by looking at where in the brain these are found, you can understand why it has effects on many of the different functions that you see here on the left. So it's involved in brain development, it's involved in memory and cognition, in motor coordination, in pain regulation. It's also involved in immune function and appetite and motivation. It's a ubiquitous system. It's one of the most ubiquitous ones in the brain. And this endocannabinoid system, as it's called, was discovered by researchers trying to understand how cannabis exerted its effects. The cannabinoid receptors are also located through the body, which is, again, just explains some of the other effects that you see besides those effects on thinking and memory. And there are two different types of receptors. One is cannabinoid 1 receptor, and these are the ones that are mostly part of the nervous system. And the other is called the cannabinoid 2 receptor, and these are on immune cells. And this is why you get effects on both the immune system as well as on the nervous system. And this is a cartoon just to give you an idea of how this endocannabinoid system works. So what you see on the top here is what's called the presynaptic neuron. This is the neuron that's transmitting information to the postsynaptic neuron. And when this neuron is stimulated, it releases a neurochemical which affects this postsynaptic neuron, causes the synthesis of the endogenous cannabinoids. These are the body's own cannabinoids, and those go back to the presynaptic neuron, bind to a receptor, and dampen further activity. And then there are enzymes that will metabolize the endocannabinoid. And the reason I'm telling you about this is really just to point out that this is a very tightly regulated system that affects the overall activity in the nervous system. It's found on many different types of neurons, and depending upon the type of neurons that are being activated, you'll get differing effects. So what does THC do? Well, THC acts on these same receptors, but in a non-physiological fashion. So it will affect all of the THC receptors. And the breakdown of THC is not as well controlled as is the system that regulates the endocannabinoid system. So the main point here is that yes, we do have a system in our body that has chemicals that work similarly to cannabis, but that doesn't mean that exposing the body to cannabis is the same as what happens when the endocannabinoid system is normally used. And the exposure to THC, especially chronically, will cause changes in this system. So it will start to change as a result of this prior exposure. So we know that marijuana is the most commonly used drug in the United States. This is from a national survey that's conducted by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. About 32 million Americans report past month use. About almost 5 million Americans meet criteria for having a cannabis use disorder. And about 3.5 million Americans used it for the last time. 1.4 were between the ages of 12 and 17. This is a study that NIDA conducts. It's called Monitoring the Future. It's a study that's done in high school students, 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. And it's been going on actually since the 70s. But what you can see here are the data starting in the early 90s on the use of a number of different substances. I'm showing alcohol, cigarettes, and marijuana. And what you can see is that marijuana has remained quite steady in all of this time. And while this is better than we might have expected in terms of the laws changing and the perception of marijuana as not being harmful becoming more widespread, it's still not the same pattern that we're seeing with other drugs. And I'm showing you alcohol and cigarettes going down, but actually the use of most illicit substances are also going down among high school students, the only exception being vaping. But what's most concerning is almost 7% of 12th graders report daily or near daily use of marijuana. That means that they are not able to perform at their optimum when they are in school. And this is probably an underestimate for adolescents at this age, because we also know that chronic use and chronic heavy use of marijuana by adolescents is associated with greater rates of school dropout. So this is probably one of the more concerning statistics that we have about youth use of marijuana. What we have been seeing in recent years is that there is an increase in adult use of marijuana, and this is past month use. Ages 18 to 25 are the ages when we always see the majority of substance use, including marijuana, and that has been going up, not dramatically, but it has been going up since 2015. This is the 12 to 17-year-olds, which has remained fairly steady. But also, I just want to draw your attention to 26 and older, which is showing a much greater increase. And most of the research I'm going to show you really focuses on adolescence or even prenatal exposure. But in fact, we know that the use of marijuana by older adults is increasing, and we really don't know enough about what the risks are, especially with respect to falls or with respect to the use of multiple medications. So I think this is something that we need to be watching out for going forward. This is just to show you what happened during COVID. People were staying home. States that allow cannabis sales were allowing either delivery or were allowing curbside pickup. And what we saw was that beginning in about April of 2020, there was a much larger amount of cannabis sales that were happening during that time, and about 40% increase. And of course, that's concerning, and there's lots of reasons that we can speculate. But certainly the fact that most states did not allowed cannabis sales to go on even when other stores were closing. Alcohol sales were also allowed, is likely a contributor. And as you heard Laura say, we're really in a very changing environment for cannabis products. And I think that, and this is one of the most concerning things, that the fact is that the amount of THC in the plant, THC, which is the chemical that makes people high, et cetera, has been going up dramatically over the years. This is a project, it's a potency project that NIDA has been supporting for many years, and these data come from seizures by the DEA of illicit cannabis. So these don't even represent the cannabis that's being sold in the dispensaries, which can be much higher. And at the same time, the amount of CBD in the plants has been either fairly steady or even going down, and the ratio has gotten much greater. And this is important because we do think that CBD may have a somewhat of an ameliorating effect on some of the negative effects associated with THC. So breeders are breeding more potent plants because that's what consumers are wanting, and CBD is getting bred out of them. And in addition, we know there are now many new routes of administration, including edibles and dabbing and other sorts of ways of consuming the products. And also, if you look at what's happening in terms of the sales in the States, there's a shift away from flower and towards concentrates. So more people are buying these concentrates, which have very high levels of THC, sometimes up to 75 or 80%. So why do we care? Well, there's a lot of reasons why we care about the changing potency. For one thing, it's a lot easier for somebody to have a very bad reaction to the higher potency cannabis, especially someone who is a fairly naive user. But also, we think that some of the negative outcomes are more likely to occur with this higher potency cannabis. And this is a slide just looking at the initiation of cannabis use disorder symptoms in cannabis users, comparing 1994 to 2012. And the point here is that when we are, and the point is that as the cannabis potency has been increasing, so has the onset of cannabis use disorder symptoms. And there are other negative aspects as well. Psychosis is another area where it appears that initial episodes of psychosis are going up in places that have high potency THC products and in which people are using them frequently. So the long-term health consequences, of course, are very important to us and really a major concern. And these are always difficult to sort of to show causality on. We generally are looking at what happens to people after the fact, so we don't know what they were like before they started using substances. Of course, we're not randomizing people to exposure, so the reasons that people start using, especially that start using when they're young, may be different and may make them vulnerable to a lot of the negative outcomes that are associated with cannabis. But nevertheless, there is a growing body of evidence that does suggest that exposure to cannabis during adolescence and probably during fetal development as well can have long-term health consequences. So this is just to show you what's been happening in pregnant women, and this is a study that these data come from the Kaiser Permanente Foundation data, and they were measuring marijuana use in pregnant women, and this just shows what they found between 2009 and 2016. And just a few points here. So this yellow is self-reported marijuana use by pregnant women, and this black is positive self-report or toxicology. So it's been going up for one thing, but it's also, unsurprisingly, not being reported by many pregnant women who obviously don't want people to know that they're using it. The other issue is that it's mostly younger people, and the age of 18 to 24, this is in California, the rates of using marijuana in 2009 were about 13%, and then they were up around 20 and almost 25% in 2015 and 16. There is a strong perception that it's a natural product and that it is not harmful. And this is despite messages that many of the states are putting forward that pregnant women should not be using marijuana. And the same is true for the 18 to 24-year-olds. They are also the ones that are showing it. As not unexpectedly, older pregnant women are much less likely to be using it. So there have been a few studies that have tried to look at the long-term effects of prenatal cannabis exposure, and these are very difficult studies to do. And they're really, at this point, there are 3 that have been following kids for a long time. 2 of them, one of them started in the late 70s, and one of them started in the early 80s. So the cannabis that mothers were using at that time, that pregnant women were using at that time, was very different than the cannabis that's being used today. And the 3rd study is one that's being done in the Netherlands, and that's a more recent study, so the potency of the products are more similar to what people are being exposed to, but it's almost always comorbid with tobacco use. So sometimes it's difficult, and tobacco use can also have effects on prenatal development. So sometimes it's difficult to tease out what the effects are. But just to give you an overall idea of what all of these studies together are showing, lower birth weight is very common in, not very common, but lower birth weight is a risk for people who are using marijuana during pregnancy, and that could have other health effects down the road. Hyperarousal is also seen. Attention problems and externalizing behaviors like impulsivity and even ADHD are also reported more in children who have been exposed to prenatal marijuana. And I'll come back to this ABCD study that was mentioned earlier, but there's even a suggestion of psychosis proneness. We don't know yet whether or not these children will develop a psychotic disorder, but the psychosis proneness seems to be higher in children whose mothers use marijuana during pregnancy. There are other aspects as well, some lower IQ, decreased verbal and quantitative reasoning, and then early onset of substance use or problems with executive function. Now, I just do want to point out there are multiple caveats, and obviously the longer you go from away from the prenatal exposure, the more difficult it is to just attribute it to that. You know, it could be that the mothers were continuing using when they were breastfeeding. It could mean that many factors in the child's social and family environment could be differing, that could be contributing to some of these other behaviors that we're seeing. But there is some consistency among the studies, which makes us think that there is an effect. Similarly, this is a study which actually it combines a couple of different studies done in New Zealand and in Australia, in which they were looking at a variety of different adverse outcomes in adults 30 years of age who were using cannabis before the age of 17. And they were able to divide it up based on the frequency of use. And what they found is that they saw these kind of dose-related types of effects on a number of different outcomes. So not surprisingly, having a cannabis dependence or a cannabis use disorder was much higher in those who were using frequently when they were young. Also, other illicit drug use and suicide attempts. And you know, this is something that I don't think was very predictable, but it is something that's coming up in study after study. And as you know, that is also the reason why we are here today, sadly. But one of the more common findings is that there's less high school completion, there's more college dropout. In this particular study, there was not a change in depression, although some studies do suggest that there's greater incidence of depression among people who start using cannabis early, and also greater dependence on welfare. Psychosis is one of the most closely tied adverse outcomes to cannabis. Now, we know that most people that use cannabis do not develop a psychotic disorder, but sometimes people have an acute response to cannabis, especially high-dose cannabis, in which they have a psychotic reaction to it that eventually goes away when the period of intoxication goes away. But there's also a number of studies that suggest that in people that have a genetic vulnerability, that's what this shows, and who use cannabis every day, they're more likely to develop schizophrenia. This is a study that was looking at people who were using different potency products. These are the highest potency products, and these are being used most frequently. And again, the risk of psychosis, of a psychotic disorder, is much higher. This study was looking at whether or not cannabis users used before the age of 15 or after. And this is also a fairly common finding for many of the negative outcomes, that it's the young users who are most vulnerable. And again, this is another one that was looking at cannabis users by the time they were 18. So this has been a pretty consistent finding, and I think that it's fair to say that cannabis is a component cause of schizophrenia or psychotic disorders. So it may not be causal on its own if there are no other risk factors. But if there are other risk factors, if there is a family history, then it is clearly a very big risk for somebody to be using. It also seems to bring on psychotic disorders earlier, and it portends a worse course of illness. There are a number of studies that are looking at brain development in people who use cannabis, and again, many of them are looking at it in people who use before the age of 18 versus those who use later. This is just one study, and the main point is that some of the connections within the brain were decreased quite substantially in early cannabis users, and it related to when they started using and whether they started using heavily. Not all studies show this. Some studies have not, and there may be many reasons why they don't show this, but one of them may be that many young users of cannabis are also using alcohol, and researchers try to sort of statistically kind of get rid of the influence of alcohol, but it's really not the same when you have two groups of people, one who's using alcohol and one isn't, and one who's using cigarettes and one isn't. And some of the effects that are seen in brain structure may be attributable to alcohol. You know, it's also that these studies are difficult to do because we don't know exactly how much people were exposed to. We don't know whether they were using high potency types of products. So cannabis, you know, these types of studies, which are critical, are also very difficult to do. But nevertheless, we're seeing differences, and we're seeing it in other types of measures of connectivity between different brain regions and between circuits. So what we know is that at this point is that there are some populations that are more vulnerable, those who are exposed pre or postnatally when the brain is actively developing, adolescents who also are undergoing an active phase of brain development probably up until the age of about 25, and individuals with mental disorders, since there's clearly an association between cannabis and mental disorders. And in many cases, people with mental disorders use cannabis to try and help alleviate some of the symptoms, particularly anxiety, but that may in the long run have negative consequences. There are several studies that have documented modest neurodevelopmental effects in children, adolescents, and even young adults who are prenatally exposed to cannabis, taking into account the multiple caveats that I mentioned, maybe, you know, other differences in pregnant women who are using marijuana. And there are also effects on learning, on IQ, on motivation, and on long-term outcomes. But again, coming back to the caveats, you know, we know that adolescents who use a lot when they're young often use multiple substances, and it's always difficult to tease out what the effects are, or maybe they're just adding on top of each other. And we also don't know whether these effects persist if cannabis use is stopped. There are some studies that do show a reversal of some of the deficits that are seen, but there's just not enough research or not enough evidence yet among adolescents that stop using. The other reason we are concerned is because of biological plausibility. We know that that cannabinoids cross the placenta. They can accumulate in fetal tissues, especially in the brain. They're found in breast milk. We also know that the system that cannabis works on is very important for neural development. It helps guide neurons to their proper places. It helps determine how they differentiate and how the other connective parts of the neuron are formed. There are also some human imaging studies, human fetal imaging studies from aborted tissue, which show that exposure to cannabis produces changes in cannabinoid receptor-rich areas of the brain, and those are areas that are involved with reward and motivation. At the same time, there are preclinical studies in mostly in mice and rats, but also some in monkeys, that show that exposure to THC during these critical periods can produce lasting effects on behavior. And there are some researchers who are trying to understand how those lasting effects happen, and they are starting to get at these mechanisms and also show that they can be exacerbated by exposure to stress. So this is the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. It's part of the reason we decided to do this study was because we felt that we were getting lots of questions on what the impact of cannabis exposure is on brain development. And we've had all of these caveats that we've had to address about whether people were different to begin with, et cetera. So NIDA, along with many other institutes within the NIH, has now set up a very large cohort of children, 12,000 of them that are located at 21 sites around the country. And we started with children who are 9 to 10 years old. And the idea is to be looking at what exposure to cannabis, as well as other substances, as well as many, many other environmental exposures, including, the screen time, exposure to sports, injuries from sports, as well as just general neighborhood factors, family factors, and trying to follow these children over time with brain imaging studies, but also looking at a number of different behaviors, looking at the onset of mental illness. And it's really, we need to have these sorts of numbers so that we can kind of tease out the different ways that that kids are using, whether some are starting early and stopping, whether they're using multiple drugs at the same time. So we are hopeful that this study will allow us to get a much better understanding. And we make all of the data that are being collected from this study available to the wider research environment, a wider research community by releasing it every year in an anonymized fashion. So what we know is that there are risks during intoxication. People can become psychotic. There could be cardiovascular events, driving accidents. We also know that high potency products tend to be associated with greater adverse reactions, especially in naive users or those exposed accidentally. The incidence of emergency room visits among young children has gone up. There are risks of chronic cannabis use, and again, especially during these vulnerable periods of development. Besides cannabis use disorder, other substance use disorders, mental illness, psychotic disorders, poorer academic achievement, and also less life satisfaction. And there's something called the hyperemesis syndrome, which is a syndrome of repeated vomiting and severe abdominal pain that's associated with a frequent use of high potency products, not necessarily edibles, but just frequent use of it. It's a difficult syndrome. We really didn't even know that it existed, more than over 10 years ago. But it's showing up. People are showing up in the emergency rooms more and more. And right now, the only way to really get rid of it is to stop using. But people are trying to take hot showers as a way of dealing with the problem. And prenatal exposure, low birth weight is the most consistent finding, but there also seem to be moderate effects on brain development and behavioral outcomes. So cannabidiol is the other well-studied or relatively well-studied component of the cannabis plant, and this can be derived from either hemp, which is cannabis with less than 0.3% THC, or marijuana. It does not have intoxicating effects. It may counteract some of the adverse effects of THC, and as I mentioned, it's been bred out of the high potency cannabis that's that many people are using now. It has a wide variety of mechanisms of action. It has more than 65 different mechanisms of action, and the cannabinoid receptors that THC works at are much less affected by cannabidiol. It's more of an indirect effect. And it may have a very wide range of medical and other health uses. However, there are very few clinical trials at this point. There is one FDA-approved medication for epilepsy, but it's now widely available in dietary supplements, foods, cosmetics, veterinary products, and it is not FDA regulated. Again, many claims about its potential health benefits, and by understanding how it works on many different systems, some of these may in fact be valid and certainly are worth learning more about. But for the most part, there are almost no clinical trials. It's all either anecdote or animal studies or cell culture studies, which don't always translate into benefits in people. So this is just to say that there are active studies that are going on. NIH is funding some of them. If you look at clinicaltrials.gov, this is a website that lists all clinical trials that are going on, both nationally and internationally. There are now 148 active studies of cannabidiol, and only 10 of them are federally funded. So the others are either by industry or they're international or they're by private foundations. But it's clearly a very important area for us to learn more about and for us to be able to exploit the potential therapeutic effects of it. It seems to be far less toxic than THC, but again, we don't necessarily know enough about its effects on neurodevelopment, for example. There do seem to be some interactions with certain drugs, and that has to be kept in mind in somebody that's using it. And we don't really have enough on the long-term and cumulative exposure, especially in vulnerable populations. So I just want to kind of come back to the legal status of CBD because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about it. So as I said, industrial hemp, which was removed from the Controlled Substances Act, so it's no longer illegal under the Controlled Substances Act, which marijuana is. However, the FDA still has a role in regulating CBD products, and FDA regulates medications, dietary supplements, and food additives, as well as other products used by consumers. And at this point, CBD products that are either of these dietary supplements or food additives or other mechanisms are not regulated by the FDA, and in fact, they're not really allowed to be used as food additives or to be sold as dietary supplements because of the fact that we have a medication that has CBD in it. We can't add aspirin to a food product, for example, because it's a medication. So the FDA is sort of trying to figure this out. In the meantime, CBD is a multi-billion-dollar industry. The FDA is trying to get more data, but the concerns that I think we have, the largest concerns that we have is that there are all of these unregulated products out there which may have other potential toxins in them. We don't really know how the CBD was or how the hemp was grown. There are unverified claims. A lot of when studies have looked at the products that are being sold, often the labels are misleading. They may contain more or less CBD than is on the labels. Many of them contain THC. We hear from people who claim that they test positive in their employment, and then they find out that, and it's like they test positive for THC, and it's likely that they thought they were only taking a CBD product, but it's likely that they, in fact, were getting a product that contained THC as well. So we have people who don't really understand what they're getting, and they're using it for all sorts of things for which there isn't a lot of data. So coming to the sort of, I'm sort of running behind, and I'm sorry for going, I'm going to speed up a bit now. But we know that their state laws are quite diverse. There are states that have legal for adult use and medical use, states for just medical use, but the states also vary in how they implement their programs. So some of them have different conditions or routes of administration that are allowable. Some of them have dispensaries, and there are many different implementation approaches that states are using around marketing, product labeling, whether or not they allow public consumption, what their taxation, what the tax money uses, and obviously a very important aspect of all of this is expungement and equity for people who are harmed by the cannabis laws. We are very interested in understanding the many different impacts of legalization, both the harmful effects as well as potential benefits, either in terms of the use of other substances, less use of other substances, as well as whether these criminal justice disparities that we know were such a strong part of the drug war will, continue or are minimized now that marijuana has been legalized. This is just to say that, you know, marijuana use in the states that have allowed for recreational use has been going up. It was started higher and has been going up, which is not that surprising, given that there's obvious, if the states have voted to legalize it, there's obviously a permissiveness in attitudes. And again, it's in both the 26-year-old, the 26 and older, as well as the 18 to 25-year-olds. Still not seeing it in the 12 to 17-year-olds, which is a good thing. And this, again, this is treatment admissions. And my point here, again, is that it's the older adults, or 26 and older, and it's not, the study doesn't break it down by older, by the various ages in there. But the people who are going into treatment are now more adults than they are children and 18 and 20-year-olds. Emergency departments have gone up dramatically in some places. In many cases, this is because of this hyperemesis that I mentioned, but it's also psychosis, it's also accidents, panic attacks. And one other area is secondhand smoke. And I think we need to, we need to recognize that the smoke, while we don't have a lot of data the way we do for tobacco smoke, smoke contains the same thing that tobacco smoke contains. And so, risks for secondhand cannabis smoke are also significant. And in states that are allowing for consumption sites, this becomes another area of concern. And smoke-free tobacco laws don't always apply to cannabis. So the point is that regulations matter. That the way in which marijuana is made available in states is really, it really could make a big difference. But at this point, almost all of the states have full commercialization, which means that you have industries that are making money off of people that are buying these drugs, and their main source of income comes from people who use frequently. And so it's in their, they are incentivized to get people using a lot and using frequently. Product availability can be affected. Stores can be open at different times. They can only be allowed in certain places. Serving sizes. Most of the states require labeling of serving sizes for edible products. None of the states have potency limits, and we don't even know exactly what that potency limit should be. Labeling requirements. All of the states have labeling requirements now to make sure that there are some health warnings, and that also that products can be distinguished that contain marijuana, for example, edible products, because there have been a lot of accidental exposures. All the states are doing some sort of product testing and have different allowable ingredients. And again, who is allowed to grow marijuana, how the taxes are being used, where the money goes, and again, social equity is really an important aspect of these laws, and whether they will really promote social equity, I think we need to be following. But what's important is who is on these panels that are making these decisions, and it's often, almost all of them involve industry, and so there are always industry representatives, and there also clearly needs to be public health people involved. And I think this is another place where we have some issues around public health people not wanting to be involved because of feeling that this is just wrong, but they need to have their voices heard, and they need to be able to influence the decisions. And just to sort of two more slides, just to sort of end. Cannabis is a difficult plant to study because it is so complex, because there may be effects that people are referring to as an entourage effect, where it's not just the specific THC or CBD in the plant that matters, but some combination of cannabinoids or other components that may have effect. We don't really know if that's true or not, and there are people who claim that it's true, but it's difficult to sort of know whether or not that's correct. Dosing has been difficult. We don't really know what doses to use. Most of the early studies that found positive effects of cannabis on pain, for example, use much lower doses than what people are getting now in the medical dispensaries. They were quite low, and in some cases low enough to even be sort of without a psychoactive effect. Route of administration is important. And we need to have, studies that have proper controls that go for a long enough period. Most of the studies, again, showing health effects are short-term studies. They're studies that go for at most a month, and that's really not enough to gauge whether or not these products are helpful. We should be learning from what's already happening in the states and what's happening in other countries. Some states are establishing patient registries, and even if this is not the most optimal way to be collecting data, because obviously people who are using this may have more of a, many of the people who are using cannabis for medical reasons are also using it, were also using it before that. But also we need to know what products people are using. Are they going now for, in Canada, it appeared that there was sort of a shift over time and people were going towards products that were higher in CBD versus THC. And this is very important because they have very, very different effects. And we need to be studying the products that people are using. And that's difficult because of the federal and state laws, which I'm happy to talk about if you're interested in hearing more. We need better measures. We need people to know what the products are that they're getting. We're not going to be able to know what they've been exposed to if they don't know what they're getting. And I think this is something that's quite important. We're trying to establish a standardized unit that we want our researchers to use so that we can get a better sense of what the dose effects are. And we chose a unit of 5 milligrams of THC, but really our influence is over the research community and not necessarily over the regulators, although we've been talking to state regulators and they're quite interested in trying to find ways of, again, educating consumers. And finally, I think I think we really need to think about how we talk to people. I give similar kinds of talks in many different audiences. This is an unbelievably polarized issue, and it's very important that we stay measured and that we stay unbiased in the way we present information. We need to be explicit about what we know, what we think, and what we don't know. We also need research that's going to answer real-world questions. What does cannabis legalization do in terms of the opioid epidemic? Is it because some cannabis products can have anti-pain effects, does it really decrease people's opioid use? We have a lot of anecdote about that, but we don't know yet. It has a theoretical basis, but we don't yet know, again, if that's really happening. And again, I think right now our opioid epidemic has evolved, and now a lot of the issues are around fentanyl, but that's another story. Do we need to impose a potency limit? And should certain products just be prohibited altogether? How dangerous is prenatal exposure? So we need to be careful in our terminology. We need to distinguish the plant from the cannabinoids or cannabidiol or other medicinal preparations. And we need to make sure that the public health interests are front and center when regulations are developing. And finally, we need to better disseminate the knowledge that we have. So that's it. I'm happy to take questions. And back to you, Laura.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to take down the slides so that I can see you. There we are. Wow, you are an amazing fount of information and knowledge. You got a ton in that very short time. We do have several questions that have come up. Thank you for entertaining them. I will start at the top. All right, first question. Can you comment on Delta 8 THC? This product is becoming more available and seems to be marketed as a legal way to get high because of the Farm Bill and being extracted from hemp. And of course, I've also heard of Delta 10 now. What's the impact of those two?
That's a really tough one. Right now, it's falling into this legal gray area. Yeah. It's not clear. The DEA was basically told they can't regulate hemp products, and it's not clear whether Delta 8 and Delta 10 should be regulated because they can make people high and they are being sold as legal products, and we don't really know enough about them. There are, I think, 14 states that have made it illegal to do that, But right now, there's discussions going on between, HHS, the FDA, and NIH, and the DEA, and I think we really need clarification, and we really need it soon. I think it's a very important concern, and I think that, I don't think it was envisioned when the Farm Bill was passed that there would be these products that are still going to be able to be either synthesized from CBD or extracted from the plant that could also make people high.
I was hearing reports even just a week ago of someone saying that they found some of them in a gas station, and that they were kind of being marketed almost like tobacco products, and
I know.
was very, very concerned.
Very concerning, and I think, again, this is something I've met with some of the state regulators, and this is something that they're very, very concerned about also. Yeah. They don't really know what they can do.
Okay. Next question is there a study, are you aware of, paying pregnant women using cannabis in the state of Washington through NIDA? Are you aware of that?
I'm aware of a study. They're not paying women to use cannabis. What they're trying to do is, and what they're doing is they're doing a study. This is an observational study. So there are women who are using cannabis during pregnancy. And the goals of the study are to see what products they're using. They take pictures of the products that they're using, and then to measure what the effects are on the child, on the infant. So the study is meant to help us better understand the effects of prenatal exposure. And the federal money cannot be used to purchase any cannabis products. Women are able to withdraw from the study at any point. They're given information about treatment should they want that. So we're not paying them to do that, but we do pay participants in our studies based on the burden that they have for participating in the study.
Sure.
And so that is going on, and our goal again is to really have more information, especially about products people are using today. Are they using mostly CBD? I actually, when the study was first starting, one of the people who was part of it told me that there are people that are dabbing, which is unbelievable to me that someone would be pregnant. And
to clarify, the study doesn't pay them to use, it's paying pregnant women who use, and
to give us information, and also to then look at the outcomes following.
Yes, that's an excellent study. Okay, great. Let's see, when parents encourage their young adult or older youth to use marijuana for medical reasons, do you think they are actually informed of the risk? In other words, do they know about the anxiety, the psychosis, the suicidal ideation, some of these things that are mentioned? Do you think, there are parents who actually give their children marijuana if they are anxious, and then it sounds like from the research you showed could actually be sabotaging their health.
Right. So I don't know if they know, and I also don't know if they know the products that they're giving, because I do think that some parents who are giving children marijuana products think or are trying to give them products that are CBD. And that's one of the problems. When people talk about medical marijuana, some people are talking about CBD products, some people are not. If you go into a medical dispensary, the products are the same as the products that are in the recreational dispensaries. So it depends upon what they're getting. That doesn't mean that they can't get high CBD products, very low THC products from medical dispensaries, but even those, if they even contain small amounts of THC, if you're taking enough of it, you're still exposing your child, to a potentially harmful substance. And the only approved medication is Epidiolex, which is only approved for very severe seizure disorders, and it's very costly. So it's not something that parents can go out and buy and then just give that to their children and know that they're giving them a product that's almost pure CBD. So I think this is a problem. And we don't even know, Epidiolex is a fairly high dose compared to most of the CBD products that are in sort of wellness places. And so we don't know what the right doses are. We don't know what the right timing is. But so I don't know if parents know what they're giving their child, or if they're buying CBD products, from Amazon, which you can do. They may not be properly labeled. So I think it's very important that they understand what the risks are of THC, and that if they do, and again, even CBD, which is being looked at in autism, it's being looked at in many different things, it still has not been shown to be effective. However, pure CBD it seems to be far less toxic than THC, which is why I think parents feel comfortable using it on their children or giving it to their children.
Is it fair to say, I mean, is there messaging that could be done or an awareness campaign, to say, it sounds like you're saying there is no safe level of THC that could be given to an adolescent that could be said to be harmless. Is there any level of THC that would be harmless for a child?
I think we don't know. That's really why we started that ABCD study. Because that way we can catch kids when they're just starting, and we can very closely monitor what they're using. And it may be that there are levels that are not problematic, or it may be that there are children who are more vulnerable to the problematic effects.
When will we know? How old are they?
Well, now they're about 14 and 15, and so they're starting to use substances now. And
yes.
And we release the data on a yearly basis. So we're not waiting until they turn 20 to release all of this information. So we're hoping to get information as quickly as possible. That psychosis proneness finding that I mentioned, that was based on also on ABCD data. There is an assessment that was developed that was based on looking at psychotic behaviors or psychotic behaviors, as well as the degree to which they bother the person. It's used in older kids, and it was modified to be used in younger kids. And that particular assessment was showing a difference based on prenatal exposure. But again, we don't know what's going to happen to these kids over time.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, in Colorado, so many of our middle schoolers, are already using marijuana products, 10%. And then by the time they're 14, the study shows now in high school, many are using on a daily, at least in Colorado, it's so accessible.
Yeah, and we do have a site in Colorado, actually. One of our sites is in Colorado. So we have in other places as well that are. And actually, we're going to start a study very soon in women who are pregnant and giving birth, and it's the same idea of following them over 10 years, and we're interested in women who were not using substances, women who were using opioids. That's part of the goal of the study, is to better understand what opioid exposure during pregnancy does, but also other substances, because and a lot of these are often combined. So we're hoping to get a better sense of what happens in the early developmental periods, which also could be very critical besides adolescence.
It's so important. Excellent. Someone wants to know what your opinion is. What are you seeing from your perspective on the federal law and the impending national legalization? Do you think this will happen? And what do you anticipate the impacts will be on a long-term basis? Wow.
I'm not allowed to talk about that. I am a Fed. No, I do think that this is a possibility, and I think I don't know if it will happen or not. Probably this administration is the one that's most likely for it to happen within, but it's still not clear to me. From a research perspective, the federal-state differences have created a lot of barriers for doing research. I think the other issue, and I think this is also what some lawmakers are thinking, it has to do with just regulation of products. And the states would love federal guidelines and standards to say this is how you have to grow it. So I think the best possible outcome is that there would be better regulation of products and better labeling of products and better control over what products are out there. But again, it also depends on whether, if this does go through, whether or not it goes into a full commercial model, or there are other ways of doing it. You could have something that's like a state-run monopoly. That sometimes happens on alcohol. You can have a nonprofit that's providing. So I don't favor having this be there, because I think that the more available a product is, the more likely it is to be used, and particularly the products today, which are much different than they were many, many years ago. But I think if it does happen, I think it will also be very important to see how it happens. and what are the safeguards that get put in place if under those circumstances.
Yeah, and we tried that here in Colorado. We testified a lot, a big group of us, 13, 17, and we tried to put these safeguards in place for potency caps, but that was removed. And at first, the potency cap was 15%. And I've read research, like in the Netherlands, anything over 10 or 15 is a drug. Do you think that could be part of a regulation, if it does happen, would be a potency cap?
It could be. I foresee lots of lawsuits because, first of all, a lot of the larger cannabis companies in other countries, first of all, the tobacco companies are also often part of those other companies, right, as well as alcohol. And there will be, and I think that some of the basis for the lawsuits will be that we don't have enough data yet to say that this potency is harmful, this potency is okay. And so it would be based on sort of our logic and our best guesses. We know that greater potency is more risky than lesser potency, but we don't know exactly what that is. And I think that will make it. I think that will make it difficult to enact that sort of regulation. But I mean, it would be nice to do that. It would at the very least be nice to have products labeled well enough that people can see that if they're buying a product that's got, I mean, if you use the standard unit that we're recommending for research is 5 milligrams of THC, it would be really nice if people could see that this product contains 100 doses or 100 units. And maybe that would affect whether or not they decided to purchase it or to have less of it. So at the very least, proper labeling would help. But I certainly think that there are a number of ways you can try to make this less harmful. Potency limits would be one. Another thing would be a minimum amount of CBD in the product. If CBD really can offset some of the negative effects, then making sure that ratio is better than it is right now. And so I think there are things that can be done, and I think that some of the Canada has this start low, go slow, and I mean there's a lot of places that are trying to think of less harmful ways of having this legalization go into effect, but I don't think we know yet whether or not that's really going to pan out. I think the only non-negative finding, the only positive thing, and it's not positive, it's just not negative, is that we aren't really seeing increases in the use by very young children relative to what they were before. We do see that in the states where it's legal, they're using more than the states where it's not legal. And I think those two things kind of go together, but we're not seeing use really going up in a way that we thought it might. But again, that's in contrast to other drugs going down and cannabis sort of staying level. So.
Well, and in Colorado, a lot of the flower you can't even get in low potency. They're 28%. If you want to find 10%, it doesn't exist. So that is going to make it tricky too for the industry as a whole.
Yeah, and it also, I mean, that's part of the problem I have with a lot of, there's lots of problems, but again, the studies that have looked at the therapeutic benefits have looked at it in, they've looked at it in products containing 3, 4, or 5% THC. I mean, they really were not looking at it in products containing 20% THC.
Or 80% in dabs,
right. Yeah, so I think, we're not paying attention to that either.
We are at the end of our time. May we ask one more question?
Of course.
Because the study came out of NIH showing that there was a correlation with suicide and marijuana use in adolescents. And you didn't comment on it. Is that something that you could go over real quick?
I'm not sure which study this is. I know that this has come out in a number of studies that there seems to be.
I don't have a reference to it right here, but a recent one that came out showing a correlation. We know, for example, in Colorado, when commercialization happened, our suicides in youth, it's the #1 cause of death here in Colorado is suicide, and that as suicides increased in 2018, 15 to 19-year-olds, there was a 36% toxicology reports of completed suicides that had THC. So the lines are kind of correlated, and I don't know the exact study, but have you seen other research like that showing a correlation between adolescent use and increased suicidality?
In general, yes, there does seem to be. I mean, that's one of the things I think that popped out from the data that we were not expecting. It's not clear why that exists. I think in some cases it could be psychosis, and psychosis having people driving people. But it also doesn't necessarily seem to be associated with depression. So I think it's one of those things that we're not really sure, but since study after study seems to show increases in suicide associated with cannabis, it's clearly something we need to be looking at, I think. And I don't know which study that is, but I've just seen it come out in a number of different ways.
I'll see if I can ask this person and send a link, and then when I send out the follow-up email, we can see if you have a comment on it then. So, but no, your answer was very helpful, actually. That we don't really know why the association, but we need to continue to explore that since it's there, and that's going to be another important piece of this, I hope, the ABCD.
Yeah, we are measuring suicidal ideation, and that was a tough one to get into the assessments, because a lot of people were uncomfortable asking those types of questions. But at the same time, if you don't ask, I mean, we also know from CDC data that young children do commit suicide. So we need to be measuring that. So that is one of the things that we're looking at.
Oh, good. That's going to be amazing. Well, this has been incredible and such a great use of time and so informative. And I'm grateful for the gift of your time and your knowledge. I appreciate you so much for being one of Johnny's ambassadors. Thanks, Susan.
My pleasure. And if there's anything after the fact that you want to follow up, I'm happy to try and answer other questions.
Wonderful. We'll take you up on that. All right. Thanks for joining us, everyone. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.